everyone, Rhoda here with a Jack capsule on trigonometry. This one is about the graphs of sine and cosine. So you have two graphs in front of you. And first of all, what do you even need to know about the graphs of sine and cosine? Well, basically for each of these two graphs, there are 4 questions I want to answer. So which graph is this? Is it sine or is it cosine? What is the highest y value that the graph reaches? What is the lowest y value that the graph reaches? And what is the period of the function? Everything else about the values for sine and cosine we can talk about when we talk about the unit circle. So in terms of the graph, this is it. So first one is in blue here. Which function is this? Is this sine or is this cosine? If you're not sure, maybe you can use the values that you know of sine and cosine to figure it out. For example, maybe you know that sine of 0 is equal to 0, whereas cosine of 0 is equal to 1. That would tip you off that this is actually the graph of sine of x. What is the maximum y value and what is the minimum y value? Those are important facts in calculus. They come in very handy. So it's really good to know that on the graph of sine, the largest y value we ever reach, so the biggest number that sine can ever give as an answer is 1. And it's symmetric. So for the minimum y value, the lowest y value that sine can ever give is -1. So it's nice to know that sine of anything is always between 1 and -1. Finally, what's the period? You'll notice that I have one section of the graph highlighted in a darker blue. That's one period of the sine function. It's going to repeat itself over and over and over again. So that dark blue graph is what gets recopied repeatedly over and over and over again. The period means what's the length of that section? How far do we go on the graph before we start repeating? So if I look on the x-axis, I start at x equals 0. And when does this section end? One period is 2 pi radians. So this point here would be 2 pi or 360 degrees, but we're going to prefer to talk in radians. So the period is 2 pi. You can do the same thing with my second graph. You can even maybe pause the video and try to answer the second one yourself, those same 4 questions. So my second graph, the one in purple, you'll notice that when x is equal to 0, y is at its peak, which is still y equals 1. And so if you remember that cosine of 0 is equal to 1, then maybe you know that this graph here is going to be the graph for cosine, or maybe you know it had to be cosine because we already did sine in the previous example. So this is the graph of cosine here in purple. The maximum y value is still 1, and the minimum y value is still -1. This turns out to be really useful to know that cosine of anything lies between -1 and +1. Finally, what's the period? So here in dark purple, you can see that the shape of the first period in the positives for cosine is not quite the same as the shape for sine. I want to know how long is that period. So when does it finish? Well, it's the exact same as for sine. It goes from 0 until 2 pi. So the period here is pi. Those are the basic facts you should know about the sine and cosine functions. What do they look like? What's the maximum and minimum value? And how long is the period? If you want to know a little bit more about them, we could wonder what's the connection between sine and cosine. For that, you can watch the next video.